Alrighty, video 2. I'll try and make this one quick. You guys know the title, A Complete Betrayal. Firstly, Matt Barry's presentation from December of last year, definitely worth watching. You can find it on Twitter and YouTube. In my personal opinion, we're looking at a future party leader to contest the Liberal Nationals and Labor Greens Teals alliances. I'll say if those in attendance for Matt's speech go to the next election and give first preference to Liberals instead of alternatives like the Libertarians or others, One Nation or UAP, I'll say they had it coming, it being more of the same. A couple of points I would like to cover, mainly on population. I won't rip off of Matt too much here. I watched a video by a channel called Cyberpunk Dingo on YouTube that seemed to cover off on all the same points as Matt's previous keynotes, which did remind me of Naval Ravikant, who said, if you have something original and interesting to say, you should say it. Otherwise, it's probably been said better by someone else. So I'll try and keep it original here. The central theme I wish to highlight being the money supply and the ability to borrow. This is money lending. It is a major driver in cost of shelter. This is international finance, a subversive element that so-called controversial figures of the past, like Hitler and Oswald Mosley, were hell-bent on fighting. It is sure a good thing that for international finance we've been taught via book and other media publishing owned by international finance, we are taught to hate National Socialism and fascism, as these movements would have outlawed the lucrative practice of usury. Firstly, in my previous video I said so, but is it really our fault taking the reins? To the point of our voting patterns leading to what has transpired, I'll say we were promised, quote, good economic managers in the Liberal governments, economics which would include cost of living centred around the cost of land, house prices, inflation of goods and services, or the devaluation of the currency. The economist types are quick to dismiss the fact that increased numerical indicators do not account for other decreases in quality of life standards. We were promised a, quote, fair go from Labor, a fair go which could be centred around jobs and wage growth, wages that will not grow when subjected to mass immigration suppressing them, jobs that will not be yours when 1 million foreigners will do it for less. A fair go from the same Labor government that went on to run the Voice campaign, communicating to us, white Australians, the descendants of the white Australians who built all of what we know to be Australia, communicating to us that this isn't our country, and rather it belongs to the Indigenous, the Aboriginals, whose own tribes, divided by language and stories, had not gone through a federation of their own, as our colonies eventually did, thus putting away with the idea that this land were ever a nation prior to British colonisation. As they claim they are First Nations, this is not true. Not to mention no form of infrastructure had been established or erected upon the British arrival. Safe to say none of their promises, Liberal or Labor, have been upheld, as you would well be aware of. They have not only never apologised for their shortcomings and mistreatment of the Australian people, but have actually shown contempt towards our all but rare vocal dissatisfaction and disappointment. Again, they have never apologised. They have only begrudgingly and half-assedly acknowledged that there are issues, of course not alluding to them being the ones that caused it, and that it is, quote, affecting a lot of Australians. How thoughtful and caring of them. Of course, with the promise that they will solve this once voted or re-voted in. If we can now see that these supposed public servants have not been serving us, it is incumbent upon us to hold them to account and raise awareness and campaign for alternatives to enter politics. Matt Barry, I'm talking to you. Others, young Jordan Knight, the economist Leith Van Onselen, Liberals Alex Antich and Matt Canavan, who I would both suggest form their own party or go and join Gerard Rennick, Ralph Babette from the UAP, or Babbitt, however that is pronounced, One Nation's Malcolm Roberts, Damien at the other side, YouTuber Punter Politics, and independent journalist Michael West. Liberals as saviours. Think again. The Liberals are not the party of the people. Don't take my word for it. Look at their list of achievements. They list on their own website. Vaccination percentage rate. Off the back of COVID, I would not be bragging about that. Spending on education or indoctrination despite falling standards. Record spending on so-called health or the illness economy despite falling standards. NDIS spending, JobKeeper and job seeker spending. Record infrastructure spending to keep up with increased population through immigration without addressing immigration. Spending for childcare without addressing why kids are in childcare in the first place. Parents working overtime or 2 jobs due to cost of living derived from cost of housing. They speak of freedoms and unalienable rights, yet are the ones who established the E-Safety Commission and formed the earliest dis- and misinformation draft legislation, going on to support Labor when they proposed it and supporting the recently passed banning of under-16s using social media. Their federal platform states, quote, every act of government is to be judged by a simple test. Is it in the best interest of Australia and Australians? But in the same document, go on to talk of, quote, strengthening international alliances, maximising economic opportunities offered by closer engagement with the countries of the Asia-Pacific region. Participate in international organisations, including the United Nations. Provide international aid and assistance, including a safe haven for refugees. Work with non-government agencies to advance less developed nations. How can these statements pass the test of, quote, best interest for Australians? It could be said that international alliances, for example, aren't necessarily a bad thing, the alternative being international opposition. However, ask why the emphasis on globalism and not nationalism? Other groups, the Libertarians, One Nation, United Australia Party, Gerard Rennick's People First, Katter's Australia Party, Ricardo Bosie's Australia One Party, Thomas Sewell, Joel Davis, Jacob Serhant with the National Socialist Network have all outlined actionable policy that more aligns with our people than the Uni Party and the Greens and Teals. Large cuts or entire halt in immigration/asylum seekers, as an example. Individual advocates, not necessarily in politics, include Matt Barry. Again, Matt Barry, I'm talking to you. Young Jordan Knight, Oz Pill. I'm not actually sure of his name, but you can find him on Twitter and TikTok. Not that I have TikTok, but Leith Van Onselen and Damien at the other side. More on the money supply. Quantitative easing, diluting the existing dollars in circulation by introducing more dollars into the same economy. Now, if I'm not going to summarize this very well myself and you're confused, do your own research. This is done to supposedly promote spending instead of diligent saving which would not, quote, stimulate the economy or grow GDP or GDP per capita, which everyone seems to make a fuss about. This ties into mass immigration suppressing wages, an attack on the family wage. The family wage being the wage necessary for a man to have his woman raise the children herself at home, the family relying solely on his income. There is a deeply cynical force behind central banking and finance more generally. This is making us tax, debt and wage slaves, funding the forever wars and the international banking dynasties, but that's for another video. Without an increase in production of goods and services, this will see more total dollars chasing the same quantity of a product or service. In turn, the indicative price of the product or service will increase, or rather, the power of the original amount of dollars relative to the dollars in circulation has decreased from the introduction of more dollars. The increase in indicative price of the product and service is not representative of an improved quality. Real price increases come with real increases in value. For example, a new technology component or feature in a smartphone, in a car, or in appliances. but things on their own do not have to go up in price if they are not improved in quality and there is no reduced production or scarcity. They should rather be going down in price over time due to efficiency in manufacturing. Real changes in cost, actual supply and demand. Now, this is a silly example, but it's quite simple to wrap your head around. If a region that grows a crop like bananas or pineapples experience a catastrophic weather event that ruins a large majority of the crops, the total quantity of crops, the product available to be freighted into grocery stores for purchase is far less to the relative norm. In some cases, like this, it may be temporary to recover in time, or in other cases permanent, depending on the extent of the adverse event. An example could be a large manufacturer of a given product goes bankrupt. Thus, with the same amount of dollars from roughly the same number of purchasers or consumers purchasing the previous normal quantity of product, chasing a now reduced quantity of product available to purchase, the price of its product is to increase in this case as the demand for the product is still at its previous normal relative to previous price. This price is based on previous supply. Over time, if supply does not increase back to previous norm, then prices will remain at a new high for a short time, and it would likely be the case that demand begins to reduce as they seek cheaper alternatives. With reducing demand for the same quantity, the price should then fall and demand will find a new equilibrium. If instead supply increases or recovers back in line with the previous norm, then price will also reduce back to normal and demand should remain as it was. This example can also apply to any other products, meat products you can think of. If some sort of disease were to outbreak in the livestock, or by some circumstance a factory shutting down which produces an essential, could be a computer component for electronics, not that we fucking do that here anymore. On population. So Matt, in his recent video, has said increase in house prices are purely from increase in population. I would like to look at this further. Take Adelaide, for example, where the rate of house price growth has been significant in its own right, even pre-COVID, of course not the same as Sydney and Melbourne. The rate of this growth correlates, acknowledging correlation is not always causation, it correlates more so with low RBA cash rates from late 2000 through the 2010s compared to that of net increase in population over the same time frame. This does not mean population has no bearing. It obviously does. It should just be the case that if population is the only driver, cities like Adelaide, Hobart, Canberra, which did not see as large population growth as Melbourne and Sydney in the 10 years leading to COVID 2020. From 2009 to 2011, Adelaide 137,000, Canberra 87,000, and Hobart 32,000 increase, according to the ABS. These cities should not have seen such sizable house price increase over that time as they did. Just keep building. Regardless of the small and big things that contribute to prices, we cannot outbuild this issue. High-rise apartments planned for Sydney and Melbourne are merely to keep up with the continual record immigration. Australians do not want to live here. The simple analogy, now I've actually stolen this from a Twitter comment. I don't know the usernames, but for some random reason, if he's watching this, shout out to you. The comment is, if you're running a bath and the water starts to overflow, you don't try and quickly build another bath, you instead turn off the tap. Now, this is comically obvious, but what are the government doing then? Immigration must be halted. I would go on to say deportations of non-Europeans would be ideal more for cultural reasons. The country must be restructured to a climate of economic stability and furthermore prosperity. Then the cultural and societal repercussions of mass foreigners pouring into the country needs to be assessed and understood so it becomes unanimous that non-European immigration will not recommence. As stated previously, immigration is not just an economic issue. Supply chain issues, cost to build. Contrast to the examples of a crop used earlier, cost of raw building material has not reduced despite supply recovering, granted not to its fullest, following the short-term COVID shortage, thus short-term high in price, which has now become a long-term high in price. Supply chain for building material has recovered to an extent, but even if there is an absence of common triggers like weather, bushfires wiping out some of local timber, for example, or international conflicts locking off shipping routes, forcing longer routes, thus delays, or stopping freight entirely into the near future, the house prices will not reduce in line with the supposed re-establishing in normal supply of building materials. Thus, the cost to build should go down. In turn, the cost to purchase should go down as the structure itself costs less to erect. Given there is no decrease in total cost to purchase, this means the land has gone up. The building materials have remained at their so-called short-term high. We have seen where there has been no significant reduction in supply of building material through supply chain issues in decades past. You can think of pre-COVID. A reduction which would have increased the cost of these materials. So despite this, we have still seen a sizable and consistent increase in house prices year on year, meaning if the structure itself is not greatly increasing in cost year on year, then it is the land that is increasing in cost. But as we saw from the example of Adelaide with low population growth versus significant land cost increase, population is not always the main driver, especially in this instance. It is the money supply, the ability to borrow, debt, and the low RBA cash rates. The builders that have stayed afloat through COVID appear to have become more profitable when you read statistics of the percentage increase in certain category of building materials compared to the increase in total build cost quotes. An average home I read now being $400,000 to construct. At a large enough size, a monopoly or duopoly, price gouging with the potential of losing customers to smaller competitors who are undoubtedly struggling to stay afloat, is a risk these monopolies and duopolies consider worth taking. Fractional reserve banking example. If 100 people have $10,000 in each of their personal savings accounts with the same bank, this totals $1 million in deposits. This bank can not only lend out this sum of $1 million, as it used to be and as it should be, via home loans, for example, but can lend a number of multiples of this amount. For a simple way to understand this, using easy numbers, if we use a multiple of 10 times in reserves, or a lending fraction of 0.10, 10% in reserves, this means 1 million times 10 is 10 million at a charge interest rate of, say, 10% per annum, will result in $1 million in interest alone collected for the year, compared to if it was lent out were only the original $1 million in deposits held. This is a 1-to-1. Lent at 10%, the same 10% would be $100,000 in interest, a difference of $900,000 in this case. Again, only an example, but just simple numbers to wrap your head around. The large difference in profit ending up in shareholders' pockets, furthering wealth divide. So the large difference in profit, for the example aside, if banks could only lend as much as deposits, then lending, especially for residential property, shrinks, and prices of houses wouldn't be able to continue at the recent historical rate of growth, as there is less debt available to fund these purchases. This can explain why banks support immigration. There is a larger pool of deposits, thus they can lend more money. Under 1-to-1 reserves, banks, in some irony, would actually advocate saving your money, as the more you have saved in their deposits, the more they can lend, versus currently they don't so much care that you can't save money as you try to keep up with your ever-increasing bills. The little amount you have saved is of less significance when they are not necessarily tied to 1-to-1 reserves. Government interventions. Stamp duty, quote, relief for new homes. In South Australia, for example, up to purchases of $650,000, plus a $15,000 first home buyer's grant. A buyer looking at a $460,000 purchase price previously requiring what would have been a 20% deposit of $92,000 and stamp duty of $24,000, a total of $116,000. Now this same buyer can look at a purchase of $650,000 where stamp duty of $36,000 is waived in addition to the $15,000 grant. The 20% deposit of $130,000 is now reduced to $115,000, close to being in line with the $116,000 required for the $460,000 purchase without government intervention. This means the buyer gets to bid on a property $190,000 more expensive with roughly the same contributions. What do you think this means for new homes? The developers have raised their prices almost overnight with, quote, first home buyers noted in the description of their sale listings. Granted, we should not even have to pay stamp duty, but you can see the mechanics of the relief does not address the issue being the price of the property. Rather, it reduces the amount it takes to buy into the same property, further pushing up the price. A thought. How much would people be willing to pay if they weren't required to contribute any of their own savings into the purchase and instead use only debt? Whereas how little would they be willing to pay if they weren't able to borrow to purchase, instead using only their savings? Have we asked ourselves why we even need loans to buy our houses? Now this is another video regarding international finance. So just look at a difference in interest rates and loan terms. At the higher interest rate over a much shorter loan term, this requires higher repayments, so borrowing capacity is limited. At a lower interest rate, like when the rates were at 2% through COVID, over a longer term, as we see terms are now 30, 35, 40, even some are proposing 50 years. Over a longer loan term, this requires much less in repayments. Thus, your borrowing capacity is far greater. This is clear correlation which explains the outbidding and price run we have seen over the last 10 plus years of low interest rates. Now that the interest rates are at 7%, the repayments are astronomical. So if you can't see the diagram there, I've got on the left a loan amount of $10,000 over a 5-year loan term at a pretty stupid interest rate. I just did it for the example, 32%. So over that 5 years, you will actually pay $10,000, a touch over $10,000 in interest. So you'll pay the original $10,000 back plus $10,000 in interest over 5 years. Contrast that with the other example over here, a loan amount of $2 million, which isn't unreasonable given house prices, over a 50-year loan term. Now I know that ANZ are proposing 50-year loan terms, so let's take them at their word. 50-year loan term at a 7% interest rate. So you will actually pay, on an original sum of $2 million, you will pay $5.22 million back in interest over the 50 years, plus the original 2, so 7.22. Contrast that with you'll only pay essentially 100% in the other example, whereas this is 2.5 times. Or go on. So the interest-free loans revisited. Example was $100,000 single income. This is pre-tax. Affordability calculation is 30% of income. So this is $30,000 times the initial loan terms will be 20 years when we roll out the program. So $30,000 times 20 years is a $600,000 purchase. The following year would be $30,000 times 19 years, then 18 years, and so on. So as you can see charted out here, the deposit required, or the LVR will reduce by 5%, thus the deposit is increasing by 5% every year. So how that tracks out is by year 20, you will require a 95% deposit. After year 20, no debt at all. Concerns. Those not able to purchase within the 20-year rollout of the program might say, quote, in 20 years, young people finishing school won't have $600,000 to buy a house in cash. They would still need a loan to pay back over 30 years. Now, the figures used merely demonstrate how the numbers could play out. In reality, the prices would come down significantly and wages across the country would adjust accordingly thus cost of products and services reduces. The interest-free loans, which everyone would flock to, being reduced in LVR every year, would see bidders capped at how much they can borrow and then dependent on how much they have saved or a deposit. En masse across the country would see house prices reduce as people bid in line with their capped affordability, contrasted to people overbidding post-COVID with their close to unrestricted borrowing capacity in a low interest rate environment. Money lenders are always pushing for easing of borrowing criteria. You can understand why. Rental prices would fall also, being that home ownership is more achievable, so landlords cannot charge as much a premium. With lower rent prices, those people can save more than previous, and house prices not increasing further means they would fast approach the necessary saving amount to purchase. So put a note here, we absolutely need to go away from using debt to buy homes. Bank interventions, paused repayments, so-called compassionate care. Households 90 days in arrears on their mortgage repayments should be foreclosed on. However, the banks cannot allow their assets being the loans they lent out, a liability for the borrower, to be reclassified as liabilities for them. Which is what it is to have a loan lent that isn't being paid back. It's no longer an asset for the bank, it's a liability for them if it's not being paid back. These properties would have had to have been sold en masse, as typically the surrounding houses in the suburbs are made up of the same lower income demographic who would find themselves in arrears being similar type of workers. Higher sales volume would fetch lower sales prices, likely a lower net amount than the amount of the loan outstanding. This is a realised loss for the banks, which would greatly affect their bottom line. Shareholders not happy. Middle management would get fired, and questions would be asked as to how to avoid this in future. Remember, rule number 1, don't lose money, and rule number 2, don't forget rule number 1. NIMBY revised, so NIMBY not in my backyard. So previously in my other video I said NIMBY's talking points are incongruent with wanting the best for the next generation. Upon review, this is not an accurate assessment, I'd say. To add some context, I'll play an audio clip of a 7 News segment. I say this as they rarely, if at all, articulate that they don't want the character of the neighbourhood to change because it wouldn't allow their kids to raise a family in the same environment they did, but rather it is the case that they want to enjoy their own retirement for themselves, back to the theme, not for future generations. So this clip in particular shows the disconnect between the affluent understanding of the housing crisis, where in the housing crisis they think of homelessness. So I'll just play this here.
These Brighton locals having their say today, I'm convinced Jacinta Allen's plan will work.
What homeless person can afford to pay $1 million for an apartment in Brighton? They can't.
So you hear there, she speaks of homeless people not being able to afford it. Obviously, she's conflating homelessness with the housing crisis, which the housing crisis, as we understand it, is the affordability issue, which is not homeless people, that's just your everyday family. But it shows you the disconnect. So the NIMBY movement, as it pertains to preserving single-family homes on large allotments and ensuring higher density is not ushered in en masse, creating a concentrate of, quote, undesirables. This is, on the whole, a good cause. Of course, there are people within the movement that are in it for themselves and the preservation of their status via their name brand suburb. The trajectory for major Australian cities necessitated by persisting mass immigration would see vast amount of projects like you see in New York, for example. It is a good idea to fight this. Of course, if mass immigration is not halted without apartments, it will instead continue an increase in urban sprawl, with the furthest fringe areas becoming ghettos themselves, just the same, made up of non-Australians, as we already see in Western Sydney. So there is no perfect solution, but that does not mean we can't continue to work towards a better one. Economic and therefore social challenges for the lowest percentile demographics will be present under any government in any country, regardless of race, across the world. So despite what some people may believe, yes, poor white people do commit crime. You can think of the white eshays or the lads. So the nature of free will, this is the different inputs and the different outputs. Those with low outputs will resort to theft where they are taught that theft is okay. This is a multi-generational issue, multi-generational unemployed, welfare dependent or incarcerated. We should of course strive to provide a basic safety net for those in need, a roof over the head, food on the table, running water, lights and heating and cooling in the house, while minimizing waste on funding their drug, alcohol and gambling consumption. News as an arm of the business. The two largest listing websites, realestate.com and Domain, are both owned by news corporations. The REA Group, which is realestate.com, is majority owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corp Australia, obviously a subsidiary of the US-based News Corp. The REA Group also owns Mortgage Choice, one of the largest mortgage broking franchises. Domain Group have merged with Nine Entertainment Co., which owns a bunch of publications, but the likes of the Australian Financial Review, which is obviously has an influence in property and talking of investing. Side note, Loan Market, another one of the largest mortgage broking franchises, is owned by Ray White, one of the largest real estate franchises. This is to demonstrate the news, brokers, agents, developers, builders, super funds, lobbyists, corrupt politicians, and banks and lenders are all in it together. Is it any surprise why the articles and nightly reports are not bringing actual solutions which would mean reduction in prices to the forefront, rather increasing FOMO, fear of missing out, and furthering the pile-on, quote, young people locked out of our property market as house prices continue to increase is not the same as, quote, why house prices need to come down for young people to break into the property market. Understand that. So maybe look at it that the property listing websites aren't the secondary part of the business, rather it is the primary part of the business, and the news is merely works as a highly built out funnel to funnel people to go onto the websites. News as an arm continued. So what would it look like if the leader of a third party ran his campaign on bringing house prices down? It would be the case that the media would run as many hit pieces as possible to sabotage his chances of gaining popular support, given the media's financial interest in house prices continuing to increase and further housing speculation and obsession. You must then understand that any politician who isn't being attacked in the media is necessarily not pushing back against the rampant house price increases. If they were outspoken against it, they would be shamed in the media for it, again due to the media's already established financial incentive. Of course, this same politician could receive favourable coverage if he ceased discussing the issue of house prices, retaining his popular support and handsome salary as a Member of Parliament. We know the media has this power. Business relations. This is non-property related. In July 2021, Channel 7, major news network here, Channel 7's holding company took 70% ownership in Boral, an asphalt company. It gained full ownership of Boral in July 2024. What would it look like if the news arm of the business used its reach to influence people's perception of the government via deliberate reporting highlighting negative aspects or no reporting of positive aspects? Instead, deliberate reporting highlighting positive aspects of the opposition or no reporting of negative aspects of the opposition. So if they were to do this in the lead up to an election, of course the news arm could assist in framing the government positively if Boral were chosen the contractor for upcoming major road projects, just the same as they could frame the government in a negative light if these contracts went to a competitor. Again, look at incentives. Foreign companies Japanese Sumitomo Forestry recent purchase of 51% of Metricon, Australia's largest home builder. Energy Australia is owned by a man from Hong Kong. Chinese are buying farmers' waters rights. Our mines are being mined by international companies. Our gas being siphoned by them too. As explained in a previous video, the slide on monopolies, it is not a good thing that the building industry is being consolidated through COVID insolvencies and acquisitions. It will only mean that there is less bargaining ability for the consumer, ultimately funding the globalist / central power agenda. When taken towards its ends, that being large Wall Street funds, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, buying up parts in large national or international holding companies, which own companies trading here in Australia. The illusion of choice we see in colluding duopolies like Coles and Woolworths for groceries, owned by the same managed funds. There has clearly been a concerted effort to turn from national sovereignty and self-sufficiency to global dependence and extraction. See it for yourself. This is found on the Financial Times. Woolworths and Coles owned top institutional shareholders. Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, all up there. Foreign companies continued, follow the money. Australia Venue Co. owning 200 plus venues in Australia. This was previously owned by KKR, an American firm, recently acquired by Asian investment firm PAG. Australian Venue Co. announced Australia Day celebrations at all their venues have been cancelled due to the holiday causing, quote, sadness for some members of our community. This has since been reversed. Australia Venue Co. had also established a joint venture with Coles called the Queensland Venue Co. So if I understand it correct, the only thing that Australians have time and money for now is to go to the pub. This is after forking out global high rent or mortgage payments going to banks owned by internationals, global high groceries going to companies owned by internationals, global high petrol and diesel owned by internationals, global high gas owned by internationals, global high electricity owned by internationals, global high water owned by internationals, internet owned by internationals, insurance owned by internationals. And even after all that, this spending at the pub is not benefiting Australians, it's going to internationals. All this exchange they call, quote, stimulus is not a good measure of Australians' prosperity and well-being. The, quote, jobs provided is not a good measure of Australian prosperity and well-being. The economists can't understand this. Welfare state and the NDIS, this is out of control. NDIS estimate cost $100 billion per year by 2035 and likely sooner. How are immigrants allowed to be on welfare? Why would we burden the country with more of those who cannot, or more likely in this case, do not want to or will not provide for themselves, when we already have a growing portion of Australians falling into this camp? It is said close to 10% of NDIS recipients are foreign born. Why would we be importing people who need assistance? There is literally an endless supply. This is not to mention that a significant percent of NDIS carers are non-Australian. So not only are we bankrupting the country to provide assistance for immigrants while providing a greater than average livelihood for immigrants working as carers, while sixth generation Australians are falling behind. Does this not sound wrong? I would demand that every dollar of welfare these immigrants have taken is to be paid back. Self-sufficiency is the only key to unlocking freedom. Unemployment benefits like job seeker, youth allowance, etc. will not resolve your long-term issue, which is self-sufficiency. If, as an Australian, you do not wish to work, that is one thing. But you should not be granted discretionary spending. Instead, it should be that these people have their necessities covered, residing in government housing, heating, cooling, electricity, water, all paid for, and given meals from food banks, but no more. The taxpayer is currently funding individuals' drug habits. So that is all for now, guys. Finish it up in just under 40 minutes. Thanks for listening. Let me know your thoughts. Share the video. and any video suggestions. I didn't get any comments on the last video, but that's alright, we'll keep posting these. But yeah, any video suggestions, happy to dive into that. And yeah, take care.